Today at Tennis Warehouse, we have one of our toughest and most debatable string comparative review, Solinco Hyper G versus Volkl Cyclone. If you look in the dictionary under T-Dub's staff favorite, you'll see both Cyclone and Hyper G, two co-polys that have virtually every feature a poly player could ever want or need. Although picking a winner between these perennial bestsellers is a fool's game, our T-Dub playtesters attempt to do just that. We have set up a comparison across multiple categories, hoping to discover if there is any daylight between these two kings of the polyester universe. Here are their results.
First things first, these are two strings we're very familiar with. So for my setup today, I have Solinco Hyper G as well as Volkl Cyclone in both my Wilson RF97, strung at 56 pounds. What are you working with, Troy?
I have Hyper G and then Cyclone in the black. I went 16 gauge for both of these today and at 50 pounds in the V-Core 98 Tour from Yonex.
I also went 16 gauge, which is actually my favorite gauge of choice. So let's break down some of the categories where we tested this string. Let's start with power control. You can lead us off.
Yeah, for power control, it's a pretty clear difference for me, especially as these strings go on in time through the playtest. But for me, just more consistent control throughout the playtest with Hyper G and Cyclone gives me a little bit more elasticity, the energy return, especially as it settles in and the tension drops. I get a pretty lively feel from it. And I do like the control over time with Hyper G, and that's why I picked Solinco when it came to power control, just a consistent response.
I would have to agree. There's a reason why Hyper G is my go-to string. I find the control to be unmatched, especially with Cyclone. I feel like Cyclone is a little bit more powerful. Hyper G does have a little bit of a higher stiffness rating, so it does have that built-in control, which I like, especially at 56 pounds. And as you mentioned, and we'll talk about it as we go, I find as the string settles into the racket, it has a more consistent level of control, while Cyclone for me gets a little too bouncy and powerful. So from the power and control category, let's go straight into feel. I kind of mentioned already that Hyper G does have that higher stiffness rating, and that's something that I gravitate towards because I don't like to feel things on the court. So I do like that boardy feel, very consistent. As the playtest went on, I always knew what to expect. I like a firmer feeling string, lower power, deader, whereas Cyclone definitely has a little bit more feel to it. You can feel the ball pocket a little bit better, but that's just not my vibe. How'd it go for you?
Yeah, I would say kind of like I talked with power control, but the consistent response and I think that I've used Hyper G for so long in the past, I'd say decade or so, that it's kind of become inherent to me and I'm just used to the feel of it. Cyclone, on the other hand, if I'd go back like 10 years ago or when, I forget when Hyper G first came out, it took me a while to transition. I was a Cyclone player and I really didn't gel with Hyper G as much right away, but over time I got used to that firmer response. It's funny to me because the Cyclone, it is more elastic and it has more power to me, but it does have a nice crisp feel right off the string machine. Whereas for me with Hyper G, it's a firmer, maybe a little deader string, but it's also a little bit muted. So I guess I've just gotten used to that feel. A little stiffer, a little more muted with Hyper G over time. And so in the feel department, Hyper G just makes every racket feel better.
Okay, let's go to the next category, which is spin. I am going to give the nod to Cyclone on this one. From the very first hit of this play test, right off the stringer, I could feel the string grabbing the ball, and I noticed a little bit of a higher launch angle. Spin isn't a huge category for me where I'm looking for added spin, but it's always a nice added benefit, and to have that extra help with the ball keeping inside the lines is always great. Hyper G, I still can generate a good amount of spin on my own, but I did find that Cyclone had a little bit more bite.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to piggyback and agree with you and why I went with Volkl on this one, but you can't go wrong with either of these strings when it comes to spin. They both are great for it, grab the ball really well, but I think that's one thing that Cyclone does a little bit better. It's got the fine little edges from sort of its gear shape, and it really grabs the felt of the ball really, really well. And I think paired with that, because at least for me, I feel like it pockets the ball a little bit better. There's a little bit more dwell time, even though they're both stiff polys. So that combination of the really fine edges of Cyclone and the ball maybe just kind of sinking in a little bit more, I can sort of grab the ball on the ground strokes and just get a little bit more action, I feel like, with Cyclone.
Okay, let's hit the last category, which is durability. Troy, I know you know the secret about me, but I have a really bad habit when it comes to stringing. And I have a tendency to leave strings in my racket probably longer than I should. And because of that, I really love the durability from Hyper G. This is a string that as it goes dead, the playability remains very consistent for my style. I don't feel like it drops too significantly in tension. And then something that I noticed with Cyclone is once it does drop tension, it does get a little bouncy, I refer to that sometimes, and a little springy, which is not my personal taste. Hyper G remains a bit of a deader feel, so for durability, I give the edge to Hyper G. What about you?
Yeah, I'm going back to Solinco with Hyper G. And when we're talking about durability, we're also talking about the playability duration, and that's exactly what Michelle just talked about. Very consistent response with Hyper G. It does have a bit of a settling in period like all polys do when you start hitting them right off the string machine. But once it settles in, Hyper G just has a really good flat line for me as far as performance and a very consistent response over time. With a 16 gauge like this, I don't break strings very often, but you know, if I had it in there for a couple weeks, maybe 3 weeks, it plays very consistent over time, whereas Cyclone, it does sort of kind of have more of a drop off over time, a decline, and a more lively feel, drops tension, and does get a little bit springy. As far as like durability in the terms of breaking, like I said, I don't break them very often, but I do notice when I go to really thin gauges like 18 or some of these in even 19, I can snap them, and I think Hyper G just holds up a little bit longer when it comes to like that frictional notching.
Nice, and I think to wrap things up, all in all, these are both very favorite strings around here at Tennis Warehouse, but if I am to pick one to go on the rest of my life playing with, it's gonna be Solinco Hyper G because of that pure control, the great playability, the good durability, and I like the stiffer feel. What about you?
Yeah, I've just gotten so accustomed to Hyper G over the years, that consistent response, that deader feel, and also what I like about the consistent response and the deader feel is I can drop tension on Hyper G and it still plays great, whereas if I drop tension too much on Cyclone, it gets really springy. But I will say, I will give some credit to Cyclone because on really low powered rackets like a mid-size or an 18 by 20 or something like that, I can go thin gauge and it does give me that pop that I want. But overall, Hyper G.
So that's it from Team Hyper G. Let's see what Chris and Brittany have to say.
All right, Chris, now I have the strings in my racket of choice, the Yonex E-Zone 100, and I have the yellow color of Volkl Cyclone in 17 gauge, as well as the 16L gauge of the Solinco Hyper G. What about you?
I went 52 pounds in both rackets, which is the Head Speed Pro. 16 gauge for me because I like the deader response of a thicker gauge string, and I really like the way the 16 gauge lasts for me with both of these string setups. And I went with classic black Cyclone. It is the deadest of the Cyclone colors I found, and so that's the reason why I went with that. And I'll jump straight into power and control with these two strings. Hyper G, definitely a little bit of a firmer playing response. It's very dead string, both are very dead. And I feel like the Cyclone pockets the ball a little more. So even though the energy return, I wouldn't say is drastically different, so I'll give the edge slightly there to Cyclone. The launch angle, just because the Cyclone carries the ball through the swing a little bit longer with that more pocketing kind of feel. I feel like I get a bit of a loopier, easy access to depth out of the two, but control is where it's at out of both these strings. Tons of control, and I love them both for that. They're two of my favorite strings to hit. How about you?
Now, I also strung my strings at 52 pounds. I'm gonna say I'm very similar to you. I think they're both low-powered, control-oriented strings. They're two of my favorite strings. I probably could play either one of them in a tournament without batting an eyelash. But for me, I think that Solinco actually just has a little bit more of control, so I will give the nod to Solinco in that category. I think Cyclone has a better blend of power and control, especially in my racket of choice, and does have just that little bit of extra power that I need at times when I'm trying to put the ball away. Now, I know you kind of touched on it, but what did you think of the feel?
I really, really like the feel of Cyclone, and it wins the category for me. It's the softer of the two, pockets that ball like I mentioned earlier, and I feel a little bit more connected to my shots with Cyclone. Not to really knock Hyper G in this regard, because I think it's a great feeling string as well. For as stiff as it is in the lab, it's a very forgiving string. It slides well against itself and snaps back, and so on a spin shot, it actually feels softer than a lot of other strings of similar stiffness, just because this one slides better. How about you?
Yeah, for me, feel is one of the most important parts of a string, and probably, I think, the most differentiating part of these two strings. And I think Solinco Hyper G feels a little bit firmer, actually throughout the whole play test, whereas Cyclone has a little bit more of a plusher, more responsive feel, and I tended to lean towards that Cyclone feel as well.
How about spin? What did you pick for spin?
Well, both these are really spin-friendly polys. I don't have a lot of spin in my game, so that aspect of a string isn't the most important to me, but I do like when I'm able to use a string and I can hit with spin without having to change my gamer stroke, and I think both of these strings do that for me, and so I'm gonna have to give it a tie.
I thought spin was excellent. I always have with these two strings, so I agree with you that you can generate a lot of spin with either string. Hyper G, because it's the firmer and the more controlled of the two, allows you to always carry that tip speed into every shot. Even when I'm getting inside the baseline, approaching the net, I really feel like I can flick the ball for an angle, or I can really rip it down the line, and I'm gonna get the control needed to get the ball in, and that racket speed then I can turn into a fast rotation, get the spin to really help it hook inside the line. I think Cyclone offers a little bit more grab for me, and I get easier rotation on the ball, maybe with not quite as much racket head speed, but I can get as much spin as I ever want on the ball out of either of these two strings.
Now, I think durability or playability duration for me is kind of an interesting one. I think Cyclone has a better durability long-term. Like from the start to finish of the playtest, I felt like it played very consistent. Now, Cyclone, and I've always said this, you can go back to years before, I love Cyclone 1 to 2 weeks in. I feel like it settles in. Maybe it has that little bouncy thing that Michelle was talking about earlier, but for whatever reason, it really clicks for me. So while I do give the nod to Hyper G for durability, I prefer Cyclone.
As far as notching goes, I think both slide well against each other and resist notching well, so I didn't have issues in that regard, and I felt like they played spin-friendly throughout the duration of the test. But Cyclone, I'm going to restring it every 2 weeks, just because when it does drop tension, I lose the feel that I love when it's fresh off the stringer, and that's the feel I know that you really enjoy. And then with Hyper G, I feel like it holds that feel a little bit longer. I can play it into a 3rd week. So I would be stringing a little bit more often with Cyclone, but I'm going to give something away here. It's something I would be willing to do.
I think if I look at all the other tangibles and look at the overall, I love that Cyclone offers a couple more colors. I can match my colors to racket or switch it up. It's also maybe just a slightly better, I do think both of them are great value polys, but maybe just a little bit better price-wise. So if I have to go between, or choose between the two, I'm going Volkl Cyclone.
Tough decision for me to make, but I'm right there with you. If I'm just playing Hyper G, there's nothing wrong with the Hyper G. I would go play a tournament tomorrow with it in my racket and be perfectly happy and confident that I'm going to play my best tennis. But playing them side by side, it comes down to the feel for me, and I just slightly prefer the feel of Cyclone. And so even though I'm going to have to restring it a little bit more often, that would be my choice.
For more information on these strings or anything else tennis related, head to Tennis Warehouse, Tennis Warehouse Europe, or Tennis Only.